Thank you all so much for joining us here. I am delighted to be the host and moderator for this very exciting panel discussion where we're going to be talking about the racial wealth gap. And this segment is going to be a continuation in the series on 5 big ideas in inequality, which is really designed to be an agenda setting series that's going to provide an opportunity for us to introduce and to showcase the range of important work that's being done on issues of inequality. And we hope that the discussion in this particular panel and in the series of panels that we've had so far is going to really spark really interesting and innovative ideas. My name is Peter Blair. I'm a professor here at Harvard University in the Graduate School of Education. I'm also affiliated with the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy. And so I wear these dual hats. And we have a tremendous panel for you guys. So I want to introduce our 4 panelists. So first, let me start off with Professor Fenaba Addo. Fenaba is the Lorna Jorgensen Wendt Professor of Money, Relationships, and Equality in the Department of Consumer Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work examines debt and wealth inequality with a focus on family relationships and higher education. She received her PhD in policy analysis and management from Cornell University, and she holds a BS in economics from Duke University. Fenaba, welcome. Thank you. Professor Vicki Bogan is the Geller Family Associate Professor of Finance in the S.C. Johnson College of Business at Cornell University. She's also the founder and director of Cornell's Institute for Behavioral and Household Finance, which studies investment decision-making with the goal of shedding light on how to better model observed financial behavior. Vicki is also the co-founding editor of the Journal of Financial Planning and is a member of the Academic Research Council for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Vicki is a PhD in economics from Brown University, an MA from Brown, an MBA from Wharton, and an SBC in applied math, also from Brown. Vicki, welcome to our panel. Our third panelist is Mr. Stephen LaFata, who is a partner of the Paradigm Group, which is a private wealth management team at UBS in San Diego, California. Send some sunshine our way, please. Prior to joining this team, Stephen was the chief operations and chief compliance officer of Aletheia Capital Management. He brings a wealth of experience working with clients to formulate financial plans, creating optimal portfolio strategies, and running all aspects of financial services. Stephen received his MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, graduating with honors. He also holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a bachelor's of arts in mathematics from Duke. Stephen is an active member in the San Diego theater community, and he also directs shows at his local church. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you.
And our 4th panelist, who's going to be joining us midway through our discussion, is Professor William Darity, who is a prolific scholar. Professor Darity is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and is the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equality at Duke University. He has served as a chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. He has also served as the editor-in-chief of the latest edition of the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, and he has published over 300 papers and edited or published over 13 books, his most recent of which is particularly germane to the conversation that we're having today. And that book is entitled From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. So again, to all of our panelists, welcome. And to all of you who are joining us, students, faculty members at Harvard, beyond, members of the general public, we're so delighted to have you here. Let me just give you a little bit of orientation in terms of how we're going to structure the panel. So we're going to start out with a series of questions that's really going to set up and situate what is racial wealth inequality. And from there, we're going to move to our second segment in which each of the panelists will have an extended amount of time to share what's their big idea for understanding and or reducing wealth inequality. And then after that, we're going to have some vibrant discussion between the panelists in terms of sharpening each other's ideas. And then we also want to have questions from you, members of the audience. And so that's going to be the structure that we're going to have today. I encourage you as you go through the panel to post any questions that you have. And what we're going to do is Pam will help me with monitoring the questions. And when we come to the end of When we come to the Q&A segment, what we'll do is we will select some questions that are representative of the kinds of questions that you want to ask. And then we will ask you to unmute yourself and to ask your question to the panelists. In the interest of time, we encourage you to keep your questions very tight and concise so that we can get as much participation. We also want to encourage students to ask questions. And so for those of you who are faculty members, we certainly want your questions as well, but we're going to try to prioritize student questions. All right, so buckle your seatbelts. Are you ready? Okay. So first off, I want us to start by level setting and really getting some definitions on the board. And the first and really important one is, what is wealth and how is wealth different from income? And I want to pose this question to Stephen LaFata. Stephen, what is wealth and how is it different from income?
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the term wealth rather than net worth. I think net worth is a simple mathematical concept, assets minus liabilities. But when you're talking about wealth, it inserts a personal emotional aspect to it. It also inserts a comparison or a sociological aspect of how is everyone else around me doing? Because without going into the weeds, you can think of a lot of examples where someone can feel content or joy with where they're at. Now, there are situations where there are people that have extremely high net worths that don't feel wealthy. And there are people with very low net worths that actually feel wealthy because of a variety of reasons. Maybe they even measure it with family, or they measure it in terms of ideals or fairness. If you think of a hypothetical example where you have a village where everyone has one goat, let's just say, and then someone enters with two goats. Well, that person is wealthy in comparison, and they may even feel wealthy. But if you talk to them, maybe they would say they don't feel wealthy because they just came from Manhattan, where
right.
no one uses goats.
And so to dig into that a little bit more deeply, so when you think about it, so you mentioned this notion of like net worth, and so let's unpack, like, if we think about wealth very narrowly in terms of like financial wealth, what are going to be some of the key components of financial wealth, and like how is that going to differ from just like income, which is a concept that most people might be more familiar with?
Sure. Classic wealth is the summation, again, of your assets, but there's different types. So you could have, you could be a billionaire, but all of it is locked up in a company. And we call those paper billionaires or paper wealth, because you actually don't have access to it until a certain point in time. Or you could have everything in cash, and there's everything in between. So depending on your asset class, whether you have an amount of cash, whether you have liquid assets that are easily liquidated, or you have things built up in companies, there's a variety of different types of wealth that's built up. Now, when it comes to income, again, that also inserts some comparison aspects to it because it's income compared to your expenses. Some people could have smaller, bigger incomes, but think, my goodness, this isn't much compared to expenses, or my cash flow is not a lot. But so just wanted to insert that aspect to it as well. And I think it's very germane to this conversation because we're talking about a wealth gap, and you're feeling this strain that people have, and the racial wealth gap, because it is important in feeling wealth that you are comparing yourself. And not just that, but the concept that there is your children and your heirs will be able to also have wealth and incomes. And all of that enters into your mind when you're thinking about wealth. So it's not, I don't want people to think that it's just, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it were a simple math question of, well, it's assets minus liabilities, or it's just income coming in. There is this social aspect to it.
Yeah, and I want to
find in dealing with
that too, because we want to return to that as we get like deeper into the discussion. I want to bring Vicki in to talk about, Vicki, what is the racial wealth gap? So taking this as a very narrow definition of like, wealth being kind of like, well, what's the assets that you have, and income being kind of like, what is it that you earn through your labor? What is the racial wealth gap?
Well, I think you have to, when we think about the wealth gap, we have to think about it in terms of means versus medians, right? And so oftentimes when we think about average wealth, people use the term average wealth, which implies mean wealth, which means kind of the total aggregate wealth divided by the number of people. But generally, when we think about the wealth gap, we think in terms of median wealth. And median wealth is the amount that divides the wealth distribution really in two equal groups. So half of the adults have wealth above the median, other half have wealth below the median. And it's important when we're trying to define this problem to think about it in terms of median wealth, because median wealth gives a better sense of the distribution, right? When you think about means are very sensitive to abnormal values, which means very sensitive to outliers. And we know in the US that there are a large number of high net worth people, outliers. And so the means take into account these outliers while the medians do not. And so the median gives a much better idea of sort of the distribution of wealth in the US. And it's a much better place at which to compare wealth across racial groups. And so just to give a little analogy, for those of you, if you think about trying to calculate mean and median wealth with a group of 9 people, right? And suppose one of the people in that group is LeBron James and 8 of his high school classmates, right? The mean is going to be very high because his wealth is going to skew the mean number, but the median, the middle point, would give a better picture of kind of the distribution of wealth across the group. And so when we think about median, we think about the wealth gap, generally we define it in terms of median wealth for those reasons.
Yeah, Vicki, I really like the example that you gave of LeBron James. It reminds me, and just distinguishing between the mean and the median too, because, you know, even if as we look across what has happened in the past couple of months, where you've had like millions of Americans like losing their jobs, and at the same time too, you've seen record stock performances, say for example, for, you know, for Walmart, for Tesla, for like any number, like Jeff Bezos, his net wealth like went up by billions of dollars, right? And so if you focus on the means and not the medians, you kind of like confuse these two sorts of things too. I also like to joke with my students in my classes at Harvard and say, you know, who is the richest like Harvard alum? Well, you have Bill Gates and you have Mark Zuckerberg. Like if you think about, if you compare the average earnings of like Harvard dropouts to like folks who've actually graduated with Harvard degrees, you might question like the extent to which like going to Harvard is going to boost your wages, right? But that would clearly be wrong, because of course Harvard is a great place to go to school. I want to bring in Fenaba now. And Fenaba, can you give us a sense of the history of the gap in wealth between African Americans and whites in the United States, and put this in a historical perspective? What did this look like right after the Civil War, and where are we now?
I will start by saying that prior to the Civil War, Black Americans were capital for white Americans. So that's where we start, right? They had zero. Post-Civil War, some economic historians have estimated that Black wealth was around 0.5 to about 1% of the total nation's wealth. And then what we know is that it's been persistently stubborn, you know, throughout the rest of, you know, until present time. So we have historical legacies of public policies that have discriminated against African Americans, that have rewarded or afforded opportunities to white Americans to accumulate wealth, and extracted wealth from Black communities. So what we see is really very little change over the course or since the Civil War. And we're at a place now, so I can provide some numbers to kind of frame where we are right now. Based on estimates from the Survey of Consumer Finances, we have Black Americans making at the mean and the median about holding less than 15% of the wealth of white Americans. So white Americans have over the median wealth of white American households. Again, 2019, pre-COVID, was about $222,000. And the median net wealth of Black households, or Black households headed by a Black American, was around $24,000. And this is like the peak prior, you know, since the Great Recession. So yeah, that's where we are. And those numbers and, you know, those gaps shift and become a little bit more extreme once we start parsing by demographics, such as looking at, Black women, Black single women who have, median wealth of 0, or if we start disaggregating by educational attainment. So, those are the averages or the ways of thinking about in aggregate, but when we disaggregate, we see much starker disparities.
Wow. So Fenaba, as you were talking, like 2 things really popped off the page to me. So the first is, thinking about where we are relative to where we were 160 years ago. And it seems as if like much has not changed if we think about this median wealth gap, which Vicki mentioned is like the right way to think about the distributional consequences of this. The second thing that came off the page to me, and I want to really, so you said Black women median wealth of 0?
A single, yes, the single Black women. That actually inspired one of my earliest research papers, was exploring why that might be the case. It was descriptive in nature, but thinking about potentially how family structure contributed, didn't actually contribute much. There's been a lot of great research since that time that has shown intergenerationally how this has persisted across generations and has tied to education impact. So.
Yeah, I think that's really startling, and that kind of takes us back to the initial question that we started off with in terms of like, what is wealth versus income? Because if you say that, the median Black woman has a wealth of, and this is single Black woman, or this is just?
That was single, so that was that
single.
in that
Okay.
particular work was single, and I think it only, if you do married, it doesn't budge much further than that, depending on the data sets that you use. Some have said it's $5, some have said it's $1,000. It's low. It's close to 0.
Right, and that's why like disentangling like the racial wealth gap versus the income gap is like really important, because if we said that somebody had an income of $0, we would all in a fundamental way feel as if there's some kind of social policy that needs to be done. This would be an eye-raising figure, right? And so what we want to do with this panel is really like elevate figures like that to say, well, why is it that single Black women have a median wealth of 0? And I want to bring it back to you, Stephen. So one of the things that you do in your work is really help people to manage their wealth. I want you to talk about the cumulative nature of financial wealth. Like, to what extent does having wealth kind of like beget more wealth, or at least allow one to protect their wealth?
There's 2 ways to think through that. So when you have a base of wealth, and when we work with clients, the idea is to grow that. And in growing that as a percent, say a rate of return, let's say you get a rate of return of 7%.
Yeah.
And the idea is your outlays, expenses, inflation is less than that 7%. Then you're good. Your purchasing power is increasing over time. But that 7% doesn't tell the whole picture, because Fenaba, to your point, if you have $1,000 and we grow it by 7%, next year it's $1,070. Well, that's not going to help withdrawing for expenses and inflation. But if someone has $100 million, $7 million is plenty in this world to then withdraw and have inflation with and spend again. So there is a point at which the wealth hits a certain level where the rate of return and the growth on that minus the expenses and inflation is not too much to continue to grow wealth. So people that have wealth, it's much easier to continue to have it grow. People that do not, it turns into a rat race.
Yeah, and this is a really important point, right? Because you're talking about people who are in the millions of dollars, and there's even a certain level to which you have to get to before like the drawdown from the returns on your is enough for you to live on. We are at a university where we have a huge endowment. And so we kind of like understand the cumulative nature of wealth. And in a sense, like having that nest egg allows you to do more things, to be more creative in terms of what you can do. With these definitions in mind, I want to stop here and now transition to, what are some of the big ideas that folks have when it comes to reducing or understanding wealth inequality. We're going to start with Professor Vicki Bogan, and then from Vicki we'll go to Fenaba, and then we will have Stephen, and then Professor Darity, are you online, sir? I think Professor Darity just joined, but we will bring him into the conversation as Sandy. Are you here?
Thanks.
This is, and are you, well, first off, welcome. We are so delighted to have you here at Harvard and at the Malcolm Wiener Center for this panel. Thank you so much for making the time and your incredibly busy schedule to be here.
Well, I'm glad to join this crew. This is a great panel that you put together.
That's awesome. Well, I'll shift it up a little bit, Sandy, if you don't mind. What we can do is we can kick off with you talking about your big idea, and then from there we can go to Vicki, Fenaba, and then Stephen.
Fenaba's talked at length about the magnitude of the existing racial wealth disparities in the United States, and I'd like to emphasize that those disparities originate with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with 40-acre land grants that they were promised in the aftermath of the Civil War, while at the same time, 1.5 million white families were being provided with 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories to complete the nation's colonial settlement project. And in fact, the researcher Trina Shanks-Williams estimates that today there are approximately 45 million living white Americans who remain beneficiaries of those land grants, that their current wealth position has been influenced advantageously by those land grants. And so I would argue that national policy with respect to land allocation at the end of the Civil War lies at the heart of the present day wealth disparity. And this wealth disparity can be measured at the median, as Fenaba did, but it also can be measured at the mean, which is at the average per household of approximately $850,000 today. This corresponds to a situation where the Black American population that's descended from U.S. slavery possesses about 2.5% of the nation's wealth, but constitutes about 13% of the nation's population. And that disparity results in a situation in which we would require an additional $10 to $12 trillion to bring the Black share of wealth into proportion with the Black share of the population. And in the work that I've done with Kirsten Mullen in our book, From Here to Equality, we've argued that the way you need to eliminate that disparity, the way you need to provide that additional $10 to $12 trillion is in the form of direct payments to eligible recipients for Black reparations. In fact, we argue that there's probably no other way to really eliminate that racial wealth disparity but by adopting a program as dramatic as a reparations initiative. We argue that indirect measures or universal programs of a variety of types are simply not going to meet the bill. One example is people's focus on student debt elimination or student debt reduction, which we think is a terrific idea, but it's not going to do very much to eliminate the racial wealth differential. Another argument is give people scholarships, give Black American scholarships. People always like to throw scholarships at the problem, but the difficulty there is the median Black household head who has a college degree has about 2/3 of the net worth of the median white household head who never finished high school. And so the educational route is not going to solve this either. So argue that you've got to go ahead and bite the bullet, provide direct payments to eligible recipients who will be Black American descendants of U.S. slavery through a reparations project.
So right out the gate, here we have it.
You asked me to go first.
No, this is good. I think this is one of the things that I love about your book, which I have a copy of, and you all should, let me make sure, you all should get a copy of this. This is just required reading in terms of understanding the case for reparations. So I want to pull on a couple of threads that you've mentioned. So the first thing that you mentioned, Sandy, was that the US government was very intentional in terms of providing a land grant hundreds of years ago to families as a way of, in a sense, kind of like seeding the ability for families to grow wealth, but seeding the ability for the country to grow. And the initial inequality was in providing that access to seed funding, as it were, to white families in a way that it didn't to Black families. Is that a correct reading of kind of like history?
Yeah, just one proviso. It wasn't hundreds of years ago. The Homestead Act operated from approximately 1862 to 1938. So
Yeah.
Maybe 100 years ago is
Yes, 100.
more precise.
Yeah.
But yes, that's exactly right. And I would argue that there were companion policies that the United States government pursued subsequently that reinforced this racial wealth differential, including turning a blind eye when there was a host of white massacres that took place from the end of the Civil War to the 1940s that resulted in loss of Black lives, but also the destruction of some measure of prosperity that Blacks had accumulated or acquired in particular communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Wilmington, North Carolina. Also accompanied by the appropriation of some of that property by the white mobsters. And then in the 20th century, we have a set of policies that were designed to promote home ownership that were discriminatorily applied in such a way that they advanced white home ownership to the detriment of Black home ownership. And here I would include the way in which the New Deal legislation was executed, as well as the GI Bill, as well as restrictive covenants, and then subsequently redlining.
Yeah, and I think all of the points that you make are so important, because oftentimes when we think about inequality, and especially racial inequality, it's very easy for folks to go to this issue of like choices. Well, if only, African-American families had chosen to do X versus this. And there's less of a focus on the ways in which social policy intentionally creates opportunities for some, but not for all. And in a way, that's fundamentally un-American, right? And so like, this isn't even, this is about—
one could argue it's fundamentally American. That's what needs to be changed, that America needs to be transformed. This has been going on since America came into existence. I mean, the country comes into existence as a slave republic. We could argue that slavery was the first form of affirmative action for white America. So I would argue that this is all too American in a sense, and that this is something that demands action, transformative action, to make America great for the first time.
Right. I want to ask you one other question before moving to Vicki. And what we're going to do is we'll go through all of the panelists, and then we're going to have some crosstalk with the panelists too. So something that Stephen had mentioned in his presentation was just the ability of wealth to beget more wealth. And something that you mentioned, Professor Darity, is that this initial allocation of land, like following the Sherman Field order, like you've done a calculation in the book where you said, if this had grown at the 7%, Stephen, that you'd mentioned, how much would that wealth, how big would the wealth gap have been today between African Americans and whites?
If there was an increase in wealth that was on that order of magnitude associated with the initial land grants, I think somewhere we estimate that this would mean that Black Americans would have had an additional $4 to $6 trillion in wealth in the present moment. That's a very crude calculation, but insofar as the total gap today is $10 to $12 trillion, then we're talking about a differential that looks completely different. Perhaps a differential of $5 trillion or $4 trillion rather than double that.
Wow. So just that one act would have cut the racial wealth gap in half.
It could have. I mean,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that idea. I want to bring in Professor Vicki Bogan now to share her big idea for reducing or understanding the racial wealth gap.
So first, I just wanted to thank Peter again and the Kennedy School for inviting me to participate in this very important discussion. My big idea will center on the connection between racial wealth inequality and racial health inequality. And as we've been discussing up to this point in the program, racial inequality with respect to income, and more importantly, wealth, is a fundamental issue in our society. While initially a considerable amount of focus was on the income gap, the wealth gap is much more extreme, and the ramifications of the wealth gap have more long-lasting implications. Wealthier households are better able to withstand financial emergencies like job loss or a major medical crisis. Wealthier households can move into neighborhoods with superior amenities, including better schools, or put their children in high-quality private schools. Wealthier households can transfer resources to the next generation via either bequests or inter vivo transfers. Wealth is the key indicator of economic security and reduced economic vulnerability. Moreover, we know from the data that the racial wealth gap is going in the wrong direction. And in preparation for this talk, I just pulled some data from the US government census website, and we see since the Great Recession that median net worth for Blacks has remained relatively flat with a slight downtick in recent years. And we see that median net worth for non-Hispanic whites was flat initially after the Great Recession, but has been trending upward, again, increasing this racial wealth gap. Now, there are many reasons for the disparities, a lot of which Dr. Darity mentioned. The reasons for racial disparity in wealth are many. They range from slavery to Jim Crow practices to various forms of discrimination, which are embedded in institutions connected to housing, employment, education, banking. And correspondingly, there have been several thoughtful and carefully researched proposed solutions like reparations, which I think I have to echo Peter's comments about Sandy's book, which should be required reading. Also proposed solutions like baby bonds, which I think make a very compelling case. And so in addition to that, I want to turn our attention toward another aspect of institutional discrimination. And so when we think about our very crazy time today, the pandemic has drawn more attention to several profound issues in our country. As we've seen with civil unrest during the pandemic, COVID has exposed a crucial, often underemphasized nexus in the racial wealth gap discussion, this link between household finance and wealth. And health, actually, between household finance and health. Oops. And so there's a robust link between health and individual finances. And during this pandemic, we've been confronted with the twin crises of wealth inequality by race and health inequality by race. And so just to give you a few background statistics, consistent with the data on wealth, when we look at various health indicators by race, we see similar patterns in inequality. Black people are more likely to be uninsured, more likely to have fair or poor self-reported health, less likely to receive mental health services. And these are just a few statistics that I am presenting. It's by no means a comprehensive list. And so what I really want to focus on is this relationship between wealth, household finances, and health. And there's a large field in economics which studies the connection between health and income or wealth. The connection is referred to as the gradient to emphasize the gradual relationship between the two. Health is increasing with increasing wealth throughout the wealth distribution. Additionally, we know from the literature that poverty has more than a threshold effect on health. The absolute reduction in mortality for each dollar increase of income is much larger at the bottom of the income distribution than at the top. There's also a rich literature analyzing the direction of this relationship. One of the clearest messages from the literature is that health and wealth are mutually determined. There's both evidence that health influences wealth and evidence that wealth influences health. For example, medical expenses are a leading cause of personal bankruptcy, the leading cause of personal bankruptcy. In my own research, I've spent a great deal of time analyzing the connection between facets of health, specifically mental health, and various aspects of investment and saving behavior that are central to wealth creation. I proffer that we also need to look at this relationship in terms of racial inequality. Racial disparities affect almost every opportunity for wealth creation in our society: housing, education, banking, employment. we also need to understand the connection between racial health disparities and wealth creation. How does racial inequality in wealth, racial inequality in health affect racial inequality in wealth and vice versa? Is there some sort of feedback loop that we need to understand or can be severed? Policy, I'm sorry.
No,
Am I out of time?
this is great. Continue, please.
I just have 2 more slides and policy cannot be intelligently conducted without an understanding of mechanisms. Correlations are not enough. And so I submit that we need to better understand the mechanisms and causal directions in order to understand and reduce wealth inequality by race. Scholars who assert that there are no relationships between wealth inequality and health inequality once we control for racial composition fail to acknowledge that race is highly correlated with inequality. I think my main takeaway is that we need to frame policy targeted at racial inequality in the light of wealth and health simultaneously. In the United States, the arguments for reducing wealth inequality can be buttressed by the potential health benefits in doing so. Right? It's important to eliminate racial wealth inequality because you could also have the potential to eliminate racial health inequality. And so policies to address wealth inequality may well be even more effective than spending the same amount of public funds on a weak healthcare delivery system. And so we need to think about how reducing wealth inequality by race can reduce health inequality by race. Furthermore, just thinking about it in terms of the gradient, potential wealth inequality consequences need to be more prominently included within the context of the policy discussion surrounding disparities in health and healthcare. Health issues and costs influence the financial fragility of households. Health issues influence investment, savings, and other financial aspects of household. Do we need to think about issues like, could Medicare for all serve to reduce or ameliorate some of the issues with wealth inequality? And I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that this is the only potential solution or remedy for reducing racial inequality. I am definitely a proponent of reparations and other solutions as well. I just think this is another aspect that we need to start thinking about, this connection between racial wealth inequality and racial health inequality.
Vicki, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important to have a diversity of perspectives here, because I think even for me, hearing what you said about the fact that a lot of a leading reason for bankruptcies is medical expenses. I did not know that. How many of you here knew that? If you did, just put a thumbs up. That's incredible. And so when we start to think about, there are 2 questions I wanted to ask you as brief follow-ups. So can you tease out some more of the mechanisms that underlie the relationship between wealth and health? So you talked about bankruptcies. What are some other potential channels through which health impacts wealth?
Well, it works 2 ways. I mean, so if you think about the effects of health on wealth, we have the fact that I told you about medical bankruptcies being one of the leading medical expenses being one of the leading causes of personal bankruptcy, but also health influences your ability to work and can have very direct effect on income, which is another kind of input into your wealth. When we think about, one of the key mechanisms is this being healthy enough to work and health affecting income, which affects your wealth in a very significant way. We know from the literature on the gradient that wealth has been shown to have a strong connection with health as well. And so there's a strong relationship between wealth and mortality. And we know the relationship is bidirectional. And I think there's been a lot of study on kind of the gradient in general, this relationship between health and wealth, but it hasn't been framed in the context of inequality. And so these differences, these first differences, I think is an important area for research and trying to unpack the most salient mechanisms that are contributing to both wealth and health inequality.
Yeah, what a terrific and eye-opening presentation, Vicki. Thank you so much for that and for your important research on the topic. I'll make one other quick note and then transition to Professor Addo, which is that even our ability to benefit from the social safety net, for example, to benefit from Social Security, is predicated on living. And so to the extent that there's inequality in terms of life expectancy, that also disproportionately impacts folks who may not have as much health to be able to live longer, to reap the benefits of society, and to pass that on to their children too. So this is a really important piece of the conversation. We're so glad that you brought this to Addo. Your big idea for reducing and or understanding the racial wealth gap.
Hi, thanks for having me again, Peter and everyone. So we currently live at a time in which the message that educational attainment is one of the strongest predictors of social mobility is quite pervasive. In fact, a college degree is becoming a defining characteristic of social mobility and achieving an income-defined middle-class status. As you can see in this chart that plots median household income for Black and white households by educational attainment of the household head, a college degree pays off, right? There's a positive relationship between educational attainment and earnings. In 2019, while white households always consistently earn more than Black households, the returns to a college degree are clearly greater than less schooling for both Black and white households. It's also important to note that the gap widens in both absolute and relative terms as educational attainment increases. Studies have found that lifetime earnings for those with a college degree are expected to be about $1 million more than those with a high school diploma. Although it's important to note that the lifetime earnings of Black and Latinx households are at least 20% lower than those of similarly educated white families. And this is a gap of approximately or close to $500,000. So it is not surprising that post-secondary education is viewed as critical for young adults, despite the racial income disparities, to improve one's socioeconomic standing. However, using only an earnings-based income measure to define the economic value of post-secondary education is incomplete and misleading, I would argue, is particularly in an era of rising family costs and the necessity of higher education. So my big idea is that right now, we must also use wealth to assess the returns to higher education, and it's particularly important for understanding its impact on marginalized groups. So using wealth as a metric both directly incorporates the role of debt burden, of education debt burden, and unmask the economic fragility of college-educated Black households, as you can see in this chart. In 2019, households headed by a Black college graduate had lower median wealth than white households headed by someone with less than a high school degree. Societal disparities in wealth and income mean that families must turn to credit markets for assistance to help cover the costs of attendance. Students and their families who weigh these costs against the anticipated returns of a degree over the course of one's lifetime are making a rational decision steeped in extreme personal financial risk. This debt-financed higher education system capitalizes on growing societal inequalities, rendering a college education an increasingly expensive and elusive pursuit. So Black students and their families are overwhelmingly represented in this population of borrowers, making the pursuit of a college degree more expensive for them as a result. Black young adults with higher education experience come from households with lower wealth levels. In the work that I have done with my collaborator, Dr. Jason Poole, an associate professor of sociology at Dartmouth College, we find that Black parents have less wealth specifically to protect their young adult children from high debt burdens. And that Black youth start their young adult careers with more debt than whites, and that this disparity grows over time, given white young adults pay down their debt faster. We assert that these disparities reflect processes of racialized economic hardship and discrimination that accumulate over the course of one's life, contributing to factors that that occur prior to school entry, are persistent through the post-secondary process, including institutional characteristics as well, and are also factor into the young adult's life upon school leaving, such as labor market factors and adult social roles. We also find that compositionally, racial inequalities in student loan debt account for a substantive portion of the Black-white wealth gap in young adulthood, comparable in size to the contribution of a bundle of socio-demographic factors, and post-secondary educational characteristics. So if Black young adults had the same debt burden as whites, the racial wealth gap would decrease by approximately 10.5%. The mean and median net worth of Black young adults with any post-secondary education falls far below the white figures. And these relationships barely change when we focus only on college graduates. Given the work we have done highlights disparities in both the accumulation and repayment phases of the process, I will continue to argue that there is no one solution, but that efforts to address racial wealth inequality are important for fundamental long-term generational change. And so my second, yes, you guys are going to get two big ideas today, is that we need to implement policies that will allow us as a society to disconnect or disrupt the relationship between wealth and education. And because Black students and their families are disproportionately burdened by student loan debt, a universal policy would necessarily reduce the racial wealth gap, not close, reduce. Consequently, I've had the great fortune to partner with several research institutes and serve on several working groups and advise policymakers about this research in hopes of addressing the role of student debt in the lives of Black borrowers. My intent is not only to raise awareness of this issue, but also discuss the potential for equitable-based solutions to ameliorate this inherent inequity within the current system. So just to conclude, a college degree alone cannot currently be an engine of social mobility for all in society, in a society in which education and wealth are connected. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fenaba, for that really excellent presentation. And I know that the chat is popping with questions for you on education. Stephen, I want to transition to you next to share your big idea. And as Stephen pulls that up, I'll just say hello to all of the folks who are tuning in from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, my home faculty here. I hope you enjoyed everything so far, and especially in Fenaba's presentation on the important role of education. Stephen.
First, it's an honor to be here at the panel with all of you. I want to come at this and talk to you about the supply problem and resolving a communication barrier. So get to the point of what I want to tell you about. I want to provide you with better communication tools to improve interactions with large donors that are interested in closing the racial wealth gap. My team works with ultra high net worth individuals and family offices, and many times we come across these family offices and individuals that do indeed want to make a difference. They talk about for impact investing all the time, but they don't know how. So when you have this demand supply situation, I think the demand being the gap, the demand for ideas like are being positive, the demand for funds, the demand for people to execute these great ideas, but there's also a supply of these items. And I want to focus in on money. And I suppose there's a number of sources of money, and the one I want to focus on specifically is large donors. And I want to leave you from dealing with ultra high net worth individuals and what they're passionate about, a couple of observations that can assist in communicating with them, in having those particular triggers that get them to act and act in a way that is helpful, that they enjoy, and that's helpful to society. The first is I'm going to discuss flipping the narrative to consider and think about servicing the family office rather than coming to them with a problem. Have them be collaborative and a part of the solution. I'll tell you more what I mean by that. Second, adjusting measurement tools. And three, leveraging their expertise beyond just money and finances and what they can provide. So hopefully this is a bit different and coming from the side of chatting with these individuals daily and thinking through how they can be a part of the solution. So I want to jump back first, a couple of interesting facts. Actually, I just read this morning from WealthX that before the year 2030, there's going to be just about over $15 trillion moved between generations of family offices, moved from the generation that currently controls it to the next generation, many of them being millennials. And millennials are much more interested in doing investing that actually makes a difference in the world on top of being profitable. There's an article I saw this morning in the New York Times talking about just anecdotally millennials having much more interest in doing this. So a couple other interesting facts. UBS does an annual study of family offices and ultra high net worth individuals. And the recent study in 2020, they polled a couple dozen family offices, about $140 billion worth of assets. And two things stuck out to me. First, nearly 2/3 say that impact investing, which is, again, a terrible cursory definition, is investing to make a social difference in addition to making profit, is incredibly important to their legacy. But those same individuals polled, nearly 2/3 said that performance evaluation is a huge hurdle to them, a huge challenge in actually handing the dollars out or collaborating and making this work. So let me get to the point. Flipping the narrative, and let's resolve some of the communication issues that we have found, and I can get more into this as well. We have found success in dealing with philanthropists, in dealing with family offices, with beginning with them, asking them, communicating what problem do you want to solve? And also there's a huge education gap. So educating them with the books that were already discussed on this panel, but getting over this education gap and helping to inform them of what is going on, but then flipping it and having them say, what's important to you? What is your upbringing like? What did you have to go through? And how does that relate to racial disparities? How does it relate to other disparities, social disparities that you may see? Then secondly, return to them with their language. So a lot of people want to hear themselves talk, and they want to hear their words spit back to them. So if you communicate with them in a way that they understand, and that is, they see it as being collaborative, and that you actually hear them and you're listening to them, they're much more motivated to assist you in certain ways. Number three, get their buy-in with a story, a simple narrative, and a simple narrative that is chewable. One of my partners always says, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one spoonful at a time. And so jumping into a narrative of a large amount of change may be a lot to stomach at once, but doing a little bit of change or having them understand a simple narrative can get them to move more quickly. Fourth, they want a story that that resonates with them, and they can talk to their family about, their friends about. They can understand and feel like they're really understanding what's going on, that they can spit back to their friends and colleagues. So those are a couple of ideas. I have a lot more, obviously, but I want to stick to time. So secondly, adjusting measurement tools. Donors and philanthropists made their money, a lot of them, through quantitative ways, whether it's selling businesses or that's the big way, selling a business. A lot of the people that we deal with made money through that way, and they dealt with metrics their whole life. So helping them and asking them, what does a solution look like to you, and what metrics can you do sound good to you to help measure success in this situation? A lot of times they'll say, I don't know. And then you can start coming with the facts that the other panelists have come and said, well, what about this? What if this number could be resolved in this way? Would that look like success to you? And oftentimes they'll defer to you, but starting with asking them, what does success look like to you, gets them engaged and lets them know you're listening to them. And finally, leverage their expertise beyond just money. A lot of these individuals can bring notoriety to projects. They can bring expertise. A lot of these people have built businesses. They've run some successful logistical situations, and they can bring that to bear to projects and to initiatives that are brought to the table before them. I could go on a lot ad nauseum about a number of these and other observations that we have found working with philanthropists, family offices, and high net worth individuals, but I want to pause there. Peter, is there anything in particular you want me to delve into? I also want to be mindful of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've put a lot of really good things on the table for us, and I really like the shape of the big ideas, right? Because we've gone from, Professor Darity, like at the beginning, and saying, what is it as a matter of social policy we can do in the form of like reparations, and then we have Professor Vicki Bogan talking about the importance of like health as an engine of creating like wealth, and thinking about from a policy. And there you can think about both the micro, kind of like how am I taking care of my health, but also like more broadly, what's the social policy in place for thinking about how do we as a society like help folks to take care of their health. And then we have Professor Addo's presentation thinking about what's the important role of education in terms of reducing the barriers to access to education. as a lever of reducing the racial wealth gap. And then we have what you've said, Mr. LaFata, which centers on, we have people who are high net worth individuals. We have this change that's happening where $15 trillion is going to change hands. So like Professor Darity, so to put this in perspective, basically the racial wealth gap, which is around $15 trillion, is going to change hands between really wealthy parents and their kids. And so I think that's an important point for us to kind of like, to really think about. So we've gone from kind of like, what is it that individuals can do to what is it that society can do? I'm monitoring the chat, and what I'll do is I will kind of pick up on some themes in the chat and put it out to the panelists. We have about 15 minutes remaining. So like, as panelists, if you feel really excited about a particular question, I want you to jump on it, but you all don't have to answer every question. So the first thing is there's considerable interest in the chat about universal programs versus like race-specific programs. To what extent can universal programs remedy the racial wealth gap versus them being race-specific? And so, Fenaba, why don't I pull you and Professor Addo and Professor Darity, why don't I pull you two into that conversation? Because you've been talking about like education as a universal policy, and Professor Darity, you've been talking about like race specific. So if you guys can tackle that.
I'll start by saying that I think in the specific case of student loan debt, in which Black borrowers are disproportionately concentrated, have a large amount of student loan debt across educational attainment, some with some college degree or advanced degrees. The impact of a student loan debt is, not just Black borrowers. There is 45 million currently student loan debtors in our society, but it would disproportionately help Black borrowers because we are so overwhelmingly represented amongst that group. That's not necessarily the case in all, if you look at particular, obviously like capital investments and things, so forth that Stephen was talking about earlier, but in the specific case of education, that would be an example of when it would be implemented, but is not necessarily one that could be applied in all circumstances. So.
Thank you. Sandy.
Yeah, to reinforce what Fenaba said, there's a report that I prepared June 2019, I guess, or so, which is called Running the Numbers on Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. And one of the policy proposals I examined was whether or not you could have a significant effect on the wealth gap by erasing student loan debt. And here's what it says in the report. The amount of the gain in net worth by erasing student loan debt must be weighted by the enrollment rates for each group, because those who do not enroll in college or university do not acquire student loan debt. Whites currently have a higher enrollment rate than Blacks, 41% versus 36% respectively. Adjusting the amounts by enrollment rates, the Black gain in wealth becomes $8,424. while the white gain in wealth becomes $6,560. Adding the former to the Black median of $17,600 yields a total of $26,024. Adding the latter to the white median yields a total of $177,560. Taking the difference, the remaining gap between Blacks and whites is $151,536, a decrease of only about $1,900, or a mere 1% of the original median gap. Any effect on the mean gap, which is what I've argued should be the target for reparations, is imperceptible.
Okay. Vicki, let me bring you in on this as well too, because you talk about the importance of like health in terms of reducing the racial wealth gap. And there has been a push for universal health care. And so what's your perspective in terms of kind of like, can universal programs work in terms of reducing the racial wealth gap?
Well, I mean, I think that there are two issues that we have to think about, right? I mean, the racial wealth gap, as Sandy clearly articulated and laid out, kind of has its roots in slavery and this aborted attempt to redistribute land. But I do think that we can't completely ignore the significant continued racial disparities that affect kind of everyday wealth creation opportunities. So I completely agree that we need something big that will kind of level the playing field to some extent. But I do think that we need to make sure that the kind of racial disparities that exist within our institutions are not going to continue to affect people going forward. And so I think that, with regard to healthcare, I think, this connection between health and wealth, I think it's really important to understand that the systems are structured such that there is this disparity that can continue to affect different racial groups, even if there were some kind of effort to level the playing field. If we level the playing field and then going forward still have these discriminatory practices within all of our institutions, it's still not going to be optimal.
So what I hear you all saying is that there are two pieces. Like, there's kind of the original sin of slavery and the way in which that, in a sense, instantiated the racial wealth gap. And that's just grown over time. And then you layer on top of that kind of like racialized public policy that has exacerbated the racial wealth gap. And in some sense, this calls for specific action for two reasons. Number one, because the original sin itself was race specific. And then number two, a lot of the attendant public policies themselves are having a disproportionately negative impact on the wealth accumulation for African Americans. And so this is putting, in a sense, the past in conversation with the future. And there's this deep kind of like moral point about to what extent are we as a society kind of like culpable because of this original sin of slavery for the racial wealth gap too. And that's something that should not be ignored. And I saw in the comments too, there was a question about whether or not reparations should extend to Black immigrants. And Sandy, you answered that in the chat in terms of saying that, reparations should really be specifically targeted to African descendants of slaves as a policy instrument, notwithstanding the fact that addressing structural racism still is an important public policy matter. I want to bring you and Stephen on a question that's being raised by Andrew Park, which says effectively 90% of stocks are owned by white households and about 1.5 to 1.9% of stocks are owned by Black and Hispanic households. And one proposal, Stephen, that's been offered to reduce the racial wealth gap is this idea of baby bonds, where a kid is born, you endow each child in the US in a progressive way with a certain amount of like US T-bills that are going to mature at the time that they're 18. And then they can use that for college, they can use that for buying a first home, or they can use that for starting a company. What's your perspective on baby bonds as a potential like solution for the racial wealth gap and as a way of kind of rebalancing the portfolios of minority households?
Yeah, it's very, very intriguing. I think a study that would be very interesting, I'd love to see, is you're almost flipping Social Security on its head, where you're giving to newborns an amount of money that is invested in and grown. Of course, everyone assuming the market continues to grow. If it doesn't, then we're all shafted anyway. But assuming that, it puts you in a situation where actually I think something that can help is a communication on that. I'd be curious to see the amount of money that you hand in one bond, let's say $50,000, that accumulating, the decreased amount of social problems that you have from unnecessary jails being opened and other negative social implications from people that don't have wealth, the health problems, increased health costs. It probably dwarfs the amount of money that you would set up from a baby bond or something like that. So if anything, the only thing I could proffer or offer to this conversation would be, I think the communication on that, especially to people who may say, well, that's a big change, you're just handing money to someone. Well, hold on. If you look at the decrease or declined amount of money that's needing to be spent because they're now having a reverse Social Security, it could be a really interesting proposition.
That's an interesting point. So in some sense, Stephen, what you're saying is by pulling this money forward in time and giving folks wealth, you might be averting other social issues, expenditures on other social issues. And so it's not just kind of like to what extent are folks going to use this wealth to build more wealth? But it's like, to what extent is this going to obviate the need for other social supports? Okay, so that sounds like, okay. I want to put you in conversation, Stephen, with Sandy. So you made this eye-popping observation that about $15 trillion is going to change hands.
Well, wait a minute. I got to say something about baby bonds.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go for it. Sorry, Sandy, please.
So first of all, Stephen is absolutely correct that when we conceived of baby bonds, and this is work that was done by Derek Hamilton and myself, we thought about this notion of Social Security across the lifetime. So I love the analogy that you made. I do want to say, however, that there's a that maybe the details of what we had in mind are not entirely consistent with what you were describing. Our idea is not that individual children receive an actual bond. That's a metaphor. What we have in mind is the provision of a trust account to every newborn infant. And this trust account would have a guaranteed increase in its annual amount of a 1% real rate of interest. And that guarantee would be made by the federal government that creates the account in the first place. So we wouldn't have to worry about the vagaries of the market, because the federal government would ensure that there would be at least a 1% rate of increase, real rate of increase on the fund. What I do want to say in the context of thinking about the racial wealth gap, where the baby bonds is a universal program, it could have a disproportionate benefit for Black Americans because Black American wealth is so low, and we attempt to calibrate the amount of the contribution based upon the child's family's wealth position. But despite that, baby bonds targets reducing the wealth differential for all Americans at the national median. And so as a consequence, it will not make complete or adequate headway in closing the racial wealth gap either. It strikes me that all of the universal programs of which I'm aware at the present moment, taken singly or collectively, cannot eliminate the racial wealth gap. So we need something that is specifically designed for Black American descendants of US slavery to reap the restitution that they merit from these years and years of injustice in the United States. So I love baby bonds. I'm an advocate of baby bonds. I helped design it, but I don't believe it will eliminate the racial wealth gap. And I don't think I've ever said that it would.
So Sandy, a fair point would be to say that you would be in favor of all policies, like, let's see.
I'd be in favor of a federal job guarantee. I'm in favor of baby bonds. I'm in favor of
hold on, let me just
health insurance that Vicki talked about. But don't think that those types of programs will eliminate the racial wealth gap. And if that's what we're really concerned about, then we're going to have to make the hard decision to introduce a reparations plan.
Okay. No, that's a fair point. Okay, so those policies that could be universal, but in concert with something that's specific, that they should not replace the specific. We have 3 minutes, and I know that we can go on for much longer. I mean, I've just enjoyed this immensely. What I'm going to do is I want to set each of our panelists up with a question. So Stephen, my question, I'll go around and give each of you your questions, and you'll have around like 30 seconds to very concisely share about that. So Sandy mentioned that, like Stephen mentioned that this $15 trillion is going to change hands. And Sandy wanted to know, like, do you think there might be interest among folks in terms of setting up something specifically to address the racial wealth gap, and like what would be the way to look at that? So that's the question for Stephen. Vicki, I want to ask you, we're going to have a new administration in power in a couple of weeks. What would be, what's your perspective in terms of like how we can think about the right social partnerships for bringing together, you know, politicians, academics, and all involved to kind of like make progress on this issue of racial, reducing the racial wealth gap? And then Fenaba, what's the one educational policy that you would be like super excited about this new administration doing to make progress on the racial wealth gap in terms of like translating your ideas into like an executive order, an actionable piece of policy. And Sandy, my question for you is going to be like, what further works, like scholarly work, do you think needs to be done? So those are your questions. Please indulge us for like 3 minutes to go slightly over, Pam, please. Stephen, kick it off.
The answer is yes. Broadly speaking, I think there is definitely interest in impact investing. I think there's a big education gap in knowing what is available and what is out there and what is needed. So if anything that I could proffer in 15 seconds on the communication front would be not fairness for fairness' sake, but unleashing the potential of many, many people in the US to become incredible entrepreneurs, leaders, social changers, life changers. And that is what is lacking when you have this gap and you have a lot of people in poverty. You're not having this unleashing of incredible power that we can have in our society and culture. So I think that would be a communication message that can trigger wealthy donors to say, wow, I can jump onto that.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Thanks for keeping us within 30 seconds. Okay, Vicki, you're up next. Putting all the social actors together.
I think I like the way you frame the question, because it is about putting all the social actors together. There's no one silver bullet that's going to fix this, going forward. And I think we need to have a multifaceted approach where we bring individuals together that influence every aspect of the wealth creation process. When you think about wealth creation for households, it's about wealth creation is through housing, it's through education, it's through access to finance and financial institutions, it's influenced by health. And so I think one of the key things for this administration to do would be to recognize that there's no silver bullet, understand that it requires a multifaceted approach, and bring together all of the actors that are involved in the different facets of wealth creation for households.
I like that. So really thinking about this as kind of like public policy is like very interconnected, from wealth to health to education to, and reaping the cumulative benefits of that. Fenaba.
So I guess I'll just reiterate what I was, the point I made in my presentation, in that the way that the current system of higher education is structured is racialized, right? And so efforts to address racial wealth inequality will necessarily be education policy, and that is the point that I'm trying to to get across here. And I think it's important to think to recognize this connection and understand that even now, but even in the history of our country, ways in which wealth has been denied or extracted from Black communities. And education debt is now a new stratifier for racial inequality, wealth inequality within our society.
And there's a really deep, there's several like deep points there, which too is like, even like understanding the genesis of the racial wealth gap itself, there's an education gap there too, that we need to be aware of. And that could help to drive a lot of the take up. So this kind of relates to Stephen's point about, communication and education too. Professor Darity, before you take us home, I'm gonna bring Khalil Muhammad in, who has posted and reposted his very important question. Khalil, would you jump in? Great to see you, sir.
Sure. So I wrote my question and you've probably seen it, but I'll read it quickly. Are any of you researching or solving for the racialized pricing of risk, access to credit and capital, and higher costs of basic needs in segregated low-income Black communities, which are ongoing forms of racial extraction? Even with a big solution like reparations, if these ongoing market dynamics don't change or aren't vigorously regulated, won't the gap persist? And I argue here simply that these are not necessarily discriminatory. It's the way that the market rewards certain kinds of risk taking. So wealthier people on average are lower risk, and therefore they get access to things that other people don't. So it's a sort of conundrum that we all live with. Rich people get things for free and poor people have to pay for everything.
There are facially neutral policies that actually function in a discriminatory fashion. And I think that's what you're describing. I'd like to conclude with my comment, because I think it's relevant to what Khalil just mentioned, which is there's a distinction that Malcolm X made between having the knife pulled out of your back after you've been stabbed and healing the wound. And I think that reparations is healing the wound. It's compensation for the damages that have been done by pushing the knife in. But you also do need to pull the knife out. So you need both. You need sets of policies that end the harms that have been ongoing. And you also need the compensatory policy, which would take the form of a reparations plan. So I absolutely agree that the types of effectively discriminatory policies you're describing have to be eliminated. But at the same time, we need to also compensate people for the harms that have been caused by those policies.
Yeah, I will make one quick point, Khalil. Like a lot of my own research agenda really centers around this issue. So I think about how do we look at the skills of workers with and without college degrees, for example, and over time we've seen kind of like a disproportionate attention paid to college degrees. So like there are ways in which some of these signifiers that allow people to move more seamlessly through the economic structure within the US encode like historical elements of discrimination. And so a lot of my own research is really trying to unpack what are some of those like labor market frictions, even something as simple as, you know, why is it that elite universities have not expanded the size of their incoming classes? I study that too, because if you look at the presidents for the past like 40 years, like most of them have had an Ivy League degree. If you look at the Supreme Court, it's like you needed to have a degree from Harvard or Yale to get on the Supreme Court too. So a lot of my own research is really trying to focus on unpacking some of these frictions. This has been just a terrific panel. The time has been absolutely too short. We've learned so much from the importance of the connection between health and wealth, the importance of finding ways to communicate with family offices that effectively like have enough wealth that represents the racial wealth gap that's going to be changing hands. So, I mean, we need to get those communication strategies together, to the important role that education has to play in racial wealth gaps, to Sandy's absolutely fabulous work on thinking about the role of reparations in terms of like healing the original wound. I want to make sure and plug his book, which I think is a fantastic read for all. To our amazing panelists, if you all can just unmute and join me in clapping hands for them. Just such a quick panel. To all of our colleagues, Pam, you and your team at the Wiener Center for everything that you do, to all of our donors who helped to make this possible, to all of the scholars and everybody who joined for this panel and even gave us an additional 6 minutes. We thank you deeply. Please stay tuned for subsequent events in this series on big ideas in inequality. Have a great rest of your day. Hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving, and all the best as we head into the new holiday Christmas season. Take care.